Welcome, everybody, to chapter 3. So, in this chapter, we are going to discuss supply and demand in a market for goods and services. This is technically approaching a micro topic, but it's something that we're going to develop further on in the semester and build on it to be more of a macro-based topic. This chapter is a little bit more mathy based. We're going to be doing some graphing and we're going to have to do a little bit of algebra to find some solutions for price and quantity. But the goal of today is to kind of get through the slides. We're going to set up how to hand write out supply and demand, as well as solving for it and graphing it and doing some shifts. So at any point, if you need me to slow down, you need to catch up a little bit, you can always pause the video. You can also, if you want me to talk faster, you can always do a faster speed, or you can slow me down as well. So this chapter is broken up into 5 different pieces, and we're going to start first by just looking at demand and supply by itself, and kind of talking about it a little bit in context. So the first context I like to put to it, um, especially because we are based in Cape Cod, is to talk a little bit about what demand means to us, right? So if we want to talk about supply and demand in a Cape Cod centric kind of focus, we could talk about what happens to pricing of lodging, meals, souvenirs. Why do we have a number of tourists and fluctuations that occur? Why do we have an on season? Why do we have an off season? Why does it look like that? The long and short of it is supply and demand. Of course, but supply and demand, especially in a goods and service market, can have these ripple effects, right? If demand is high for certain things, there might be more job openings, which will change the labor market. If demand is low, like it would be in our off season, like currently in the winter, Cape Cod's off season is the winter. You can kind of see here, I have a graph. You can see how we have some fluctuation from January all the way to July. July and August tend to be the busiest season on Cape Cod. You can see that here, and then we have a little bit of a low. The highest point is what we call a peak, and the lowest point is what we call a trough. So our peak season is around July to August, and our more trough or off season is definitely the winter months, like January, February, December. You can also see what kind of makeup. This is really cool. This is Cape Cod data is where this is from. It is linked on the slides if you want to look at it. It comes from, you can see up here in the corner. It's fun. It has a bunch of other stuff to it too, if you want to look into it later on in the semester. But you can see the different points of unemployment and employment. So remember, unemployment is categorized in a way of somebody who is not currently um, has a job. They might be in the labor force. And we can see this broken up, right? So why do so many businesses close in the winter? Well, there's not enough people to keep them going, and that would be there's not enough demand for their goods. So hopefully that kind of conceptualizes what we're getting into. So one of the big things too we need to really think about, and we'll get back to this too when we get a little bit further into supply and demand, but there are different kinds of goods and services in our marketplace. The first type is normal goods. Normal goods are things you consume every day, day-to-day basis. What happens is that when you have more income, there's more demand for it. More money to spend, people want to spend a little bit more, you buy more of it. For example, anything kind of like a nice meal you want to buy, anything that if you had disposable income, you would probably consume more of. So maybe you go on more vacations if you have more money to spend, you eat out a little bit more, you splurge on clothes a little bit more, that kind of stuff. And then we have inferior goods. Inferior goods work in a really interesting way because when we have more demand, we want less of it. So something like cheaper brands of food, like instant noodles, ramen, anything like that, the more income we have, we might substitute for other things. Um, for example, too, a lot of times the way people consume is that they might consume more of a cheap good over shorter periods of time than they would and splurge on a more expensive item that might last them longer. So you can think about those cheaper ones you have to buy more often as our inferior goods. There's also substitute goods. Substitute goods are ones that can replace each other. These usually have to do with brands. So Coke, Pepsi. If you're at a restaurant and they only have Pepsi, you'll probably just substitute for that. Uber, Lyft, the competitors. Apple's organic, conventional. If you're at the grocery store, if they don't have one, you'll settle for the other. And then the last type of good that we talk about in the goods and service market is complementary goods. Those are ones that are usually linked together. So if there's high demand for one thing, there's going to be high demand for the other. The example I love to give most is hot dogs and hot dog buns. You're not really going to be buying a lot of hot dog buns if you're not buying hot dogs. Coffee and cream, those go together. Gasoline and cars. Those are the four main types that we're going to really talk about. So then let's get into it. Let's get into the markets themselves. So we'll start with demand first. And I'm going to graph this with you guys as we go along. I'm going to open up a document as well. So demand is the quantities of a particular good or service consumers are willing and able to buy at whatever the market price is. So whatever set part price there is for a unit of good, service, um, the demand for it is if people are willing to buy it for that price. So our quantity demand is that kind of unit. It's our numerical value we give to how many people are willing to purchase that. The law of demand says when prices are down, demand goes up. And when prices are up, demand goes down. So they work in this inverse relationship. An inverse relationship, or we can call it something more of a negative relationship. So if we want to pull up like a graph and we wanted to start graphing demand, same way we kind of when we graphed budget constraints, right? We want to start with some axes. Apologies. Demand's going to have something called a downward slope because it's that negative relationship. So if one goes up, the other goes down. If one goes down, the other goes up. And in our case, it's going to look a little bit like this. Apologies. So we have our price on what might be considered our y-axis, and then our x-axis is our quantity. So you can kind of see the higher the price is, right, the lower our quantity is, or our quantity demanded, and the lower the price is, the higher the quantity demanded is. A demand schedule, just like we did with budget constraints, is just this table visualization of it. So if we wanted to graph something like this, right, we would go over by our price and up by what we have for, here we go. So if we wanted to draw this out, we might draw something like this. Let's see if my apologies. So if we want to draw something out like this, we would have, and then we label our axes, we have our price, we have our quantity demanded over on this one, and then we would go over by our demand. So our demand is way over here, and then we go up by our price, and our price is way down here, right? Make a point. That's not a great point right there. Um, and then that's 6, right? And that's 500, 576. Do the same thing. We might go 18 here. We go over 528. We can graph it. And then maybe we go all the way up. We go 114. And then we go here. At 114, we have 144. Right? Not the prettiest graph ever. And then hopefully we can make it so our points connect. But we're going to see something like a downward slope. And we're definitely going to do something like this on Excel, so it'll be a little visually nicer. Again, you get your demand curve. It looks a little bit something like this if you have nicer points out. A demand curve is our graphic representation of a relationship between price and quantity demanded at whatever for that whatever the good or service is. So again, we have price on one, we have price on our y-axis, we have quantity demanded or the quantity itself of that good or service is going to be on our x-axis. And we have that negative, that inverse relationship between the two things, and that gives us our downward slope. So for supply and demand, and you're going to see this a couple different ways if you look up videos online, but this is the way we're going to try to conceptualize it in this class. We're going to use that kind of linear equation, and our linear equation is that kind of really consistent slope, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to visualize it. In this case, it might seem a little bit weird to our normal y equals mx plus b, because we kind of have, they're a little bit swapped. But we're going to have a form that looks a little bit like this. We're going to have our price, but our price is usually something that's more predetermined, and our price is what affects our quantity. So our price is going to be equal to our slope, how sensitive Q is, how sensitive Q is to change. So we can say our slope is how responsive our consumers are to price fluctuations. And then we have our Q, which is our quantity demanded, and then our B, which is our intercept. In most cases, I will give you an intercept because this is something that's not as easy to maybe conceptualize. Um, Intercepts will be our representation of if price was zero, how much someone would demand. So if there was no cost, people are going to demand a lot, and that's why our quantity demand is so high on our y-axis. Where if things are free, people will want to demand a lot more of that thing. So here's an example, right? We have our coffee market. So remember, our 600 would be our quantity demand would be like 600 gallons if the price was free. And then we have this negative slope. This negative slope here is representing that each time we have a dollar increase in our each time we have a dollar increase in our price, we're going to have a responsiveness or less people are going to want to consume that. So every $1 increase, every time the price goes up by one, people are going to demand less of it. There's lots of different things that are going to also affect demand. In a lot of cases, these will cause what's called a shift. So our demand curve will either shift one way or another, and that's something we'll talk a little bit about later. Things like income, that's a big thing that's going to always change. So if income goes up, people are going to consume more. Income goes down, people consume less, and that'll affect the quantity demanded, how much people are consuming. Anything like price availability, substitutes. If you can buy one thing for cheaper than you can buy the other thing, you're probably going to go with that cheaper alternative. Price of complementary goods. So we talked about the complementary goods themselves. If peanut butter gets really expensive, you probably aren't going to buy as much jam to make a peanut butter and jelly. If fluff gets more expensive, you might buy not as much peanut butter because you don't want to make a fluff nutter, because it's a little bit more expensive now. We might also have a change in the number of buyers. So if we have more people entering into our marketplace, that can also affect demand. So if there's more people in a marketplace, there's going to be higher demand for whatever the good or service is. And then there's always change in preferences, taste over time, right? So if people no longer prefer something, the demand for that good is going to decrease. If people have a preference for it now, it's really popular, there's a trend going on or something, then the demand's going to increase for that good. Now let's get into supply. So supply is kind of like where those goods come from, right? They're the who, they're the where, the what, the how, it all occurs. So supply is the amount of product or the good or service that is offered for sale at all possible prices in a marketplace. Our quantity supply is that numerical. We're giving number of units for a good or service. Um, And then just like with the law of demand, we have a law of supply. Supply is going to actually work in kind of like an opposite to demand does. So if prices go up, supply is going to go up. If prices go down, supply is going to go down. And we will be able to see that if we want to kind of visualize the same way. We might draw something like this. And we're going to have supply, right? So as prices go up, we can also see the quantity supply is going up. All right. So the same thing with the demand. There is a supply schedule. This is our table. This is our numerical example. We can do the same exact thing. So you'll go over by the quantity and then you go up by the price. So we're going to see that our supply curve, especially if we're using that linear example, is going to be that upward slope. And our supply curve, again, is that graphic. This is our visual representation of what's going on in the relationship. So if we wanted to give an example, we're going to have something like this. So you might end up seeing, you can't really see it here, it's not connected yet, but we're going to notice that the wherever supply might cross that axis is going to be really low. That's because that's our intercept. If they're not charging anything and prices are zero, they're actually like losing out. Um, so we're going to quantify that with a negative. Our slope, though, is positive, right? So we have that upward slope, upward trend. So that means every $1 increase, for example, our supply is going to then increase by 5. So price goes up, supply goes up. So now there's just as many things that affect supply as demand, but they're not as many differentiations between them. So factors that might affect supply are things like cost of our inputs. So if production costs go up, our supply is going to go down. If materials, labor costs, resources, anything like that gets more expensive, the supply is going to go down. If production costs go down, it gets cheaper to make things, then supply is going to go up. There also might be changes in productivity. So if any kind of technological advancements occur, then we're going to have productivity go up. And if productivity goes up, supply goes up. Productivity goes down, supply goes down. And then we might also have a change in the number of sellers in the marketplace. So more sellers increase in supply. There's more people supplying the good. If we have fewer sellers, we have less supply. There's less people producing those goods and services. Now, you might have noticed, right? If we do just a basic representation of our supply and demand, there's always this really special point here, right? It crosses at somewhere. Um, right here, right? This point right here has a special name. It's called our equilibrium. I like to call the equilibrium kind of like the happy place in our market where everything's perfect and great. And that's where our supply is equal to our demand. It's the combination of prices and quantities where there's no economic pressure. There's no such thing as a shortage or a surplus that would end up causing any kind of pressure from each side. So, if we have, and we'll discuss this more, shortages and surpluses, but if there's more demand than there is supply, there's a shortage of that good or service. If there is more supply than there is demand, then there's going to be a surplus of that good or service. So if any place we are not at our equilibrium, we're either going to have a surplus or we're going to have shortage. So the way we find where our equilibrium is setting quantity demanded to quantity supplied. And that's why it's important for us to have these kind of equations. So if we want to use our marketplace, right, this now Before we talked about coffee, this is a different marketplace. This is an example that we're going to end up going through together too. If we want to talk about our marketplace, we want to find where our happy place is, where our perfect price and our perfect quantity are. We're going to have to set these two things equal. And that's a little bit why our functions look a little bit different. So traditionally, we might have something like price on this side if we wanted to do normal y equals mx plus b. But in this case, we're focusing on quantities. So we want to set these two quantities perfectly set to each other, and so we can identify what the perfect price in our marketplace is. So in this case, that means we're going to take the equation for supply and we're going to take the equation for demand and set them equal to each other. And then our goal then is to be able to isolate P. So if you follow me along a little bit here, we set that negative P plus 600 equals 5P minus 255. I like to try to make sure that we gather like terms. So I have the variables on one side and I have what we might just call integers or normal numbers on the other. That way we can combine like terms together and we can add our p's and we can add our numbers. So we have negative 4p. Remember, that's our slope for demand. It's negative. And then we're going to subtract, because we had to take it over from the other side, 5p. A negative minus a positive is kind of like adding two negatives together. So we're going to get negative 9p. And we're going to set that equal to what we have with our two intercepts. We're going to be able to get negative 9p equals negative 855. Then we divide by that negative 9 so we can get p all by itself. And that's going to give us a price, or equilibrium price, of $95. We can then take that and we just plug it right back into the original equations. And what we should have, if we do that, is a quantity supplied and a quantity demand that are exactly the same. So in this case, right, our equilibrium in our marketplace, I know it says corn, we're still talking about coffee, is 220 gallons or metric tons or whatever unit we're going to use. And then that's our perfect place. That's how we find those two things. Now that we've found equilibrium with our standard supply and demand, right? Now we're going to talk about something called shifts. So demand doesn't always stay in this kind of perfect place. Um, there's a special phrase for this, right? Where all other things being equal, any given demand or supply curve is based on this, right? Why? It lets us kind of isolate the effect of price on demand or supply, so we don't have to assume all these other things are going on, right? They can still affect, they can make shifts happen, but they're not the main focus of our marketplace. So we might end up assuming all those other things that I told you that can affect supply and demand are going to be fixed for now, right? The income that can shift demand, our tastes over time, whether or not we use substitutes for supply, right? If there are technological changes and productivity changes, if that's going to change anything. What we're trying to isolate, right, is, does price affect supply or demand? Does price affect quantity? Those are big things. Does P affect Q? So, for example, right, one thing we might set as fixed, right? If we have demand for ice cream, if ice cream falls in price so it gets cheaper, we're going to make the assumption that demand for that good would increase. Because we're assuming that our income is staying the same, our weather is super nice and it's sunny and it's beautiful and people love ice cream, and tastes are exactly the same. If we didn't assume all those other things, then we'd have a little bit more of a complicated model. That's something we can model later on, but remember, we're just trying to work through these basics so we can get to more complex topics. So what are these factors? I mentioned some of them before that are going to affect demand, and they're actually going to change things so we can see some shifts occur. So at every given price, the quantity demand is going to change. This is what we're going to see with shifts. So these are the shifts that can cause like income, taste, expectations, market size. So people entering, exiting a market. Um, we have substitutions and complements. Hot dog buns and hot dogs. Changes are going to occur and one are going to affect the other. What we're going to see is that there's only certain ways that demand's really going to shift. So if we have a decrease in demand, we're going to see it shift inwards and it's going to shift over to the left. If we have an increase in demand, we're going to see it shift outwards and it's going to shift over to the right. So it's going to increase or it's going to decrease, and all our points are going to shift over. So how these are some more the same kind of lists, right? These are just a little bit more expressive. These are what you see in the textbook too. So anything like popularity changes, substitutes, complementary goods, that kind of stuff is all going to cause these changes to occur. If we want to shift the demand curve, right, over time, we're just looking at the demand curve. An increase in demand means that at every given price, the quantity demanded is higher, so that the demand curve shifts to the right. So in this case, we see this one shift to the right from D0 to D1. That's that increase. And you can see that at the same price, we have higher demand, right? There's higher quantity demanded. Same price, higher quantity demanded. If we have a decrease in demand, we're moving the other way, right? At that same price, there's less demand. There's less quantity demanded. And that's our decrease is represented by DQ, and our increase in this case is represented by D1. And our original is at 0. If income is to increase, consumers will purchase larger quantities. It's going to push demand. We're going to go from figure A to figure B. Yeah. This is just focusing on the demand side, though. If we want to focus on the connection between supply and demand, if we have a decrease in demand, right, we're going to have a new equilibrium point, right? Our new happy place in our market. In this case, there's only special things that are going to happen. They're going to happen the same kind of way, no matter what good or service we're talking about. So, if we have a decrease in demand, demand goes down, we're going to also see our equilibrium price is going to go down. And the quantity produced and purchased, so our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied, is going to decrease. So, if demand goes down, price goes down, and quantity goes down. And we can think about that in the opposite. There's also, I'm going to show you, there's a graph for it too. But if we had the opposite happen, right? If demand goes up, we're going to see price go up and quantity go up. What about supply, right? So supply gets affected by the same things I've already mentioned: technology, productivity increases, input decreases, material cost. Expectations are also a big one too. Expectations usually affect things like investments, expectations for the future, expectations for how well a good is or service is going to do can affect it, the number of producers, and then our substitutes and complements. So if supply increases, we'll see a shift over to the right. If supply decreases, we'll see a shift over to the left. Same kind of stuff. This is the examples the textbook likes to give us. So if we have decrease in supply, that means that at every given price, the quantity supplied is lower. So the curve shifts to the left. So in this case, we're going from SO to S1, right? From here over to here. If we have an increase in supply goes up. That means that at every given price, the quantity supplied is higher, so that the supply curve shifts to the right from SO to S2. So if we have a decrease, that's represented by S0 to S1. An increase is from S0 to S2. So what happens to price and quantity itself? right? So in this case, we have an increase in supply that's going to decrease price and quantity produced and purchases are increasing. So if supply goes up, price goes down, quantity goes up. If we have the opposite, supply goes down, price will go up, and quantity go down. These work in that inverse relationship, that opposite relationship. One thing that affects shifting supply too, because remember, supply side is that firm side. So you can kind of think about what happens with demand because you yourself are a consumer. You are the quantity demanding. You are the thing demanding. But when we think about the firm side, it's a little bit different, right? Supply is a mix of what profit we want and the cost of production. So it has a couple different components to it, right? So the cost of production and the desired profit is equal to the price a firm sets for a product. So our set thing in our marketplace is usually that price. Because the cost of production and desired profit equal the price a firm will set for production, if the cost of production goes up, our inputs, the labor costs, technological changes, anything like that, the price for the product will also need to increase. And this is going to cause a shift in our supply, right? When the cost of production increases, that shifts the curve up and goes up to that new price level. So this is really good. If you write anything down, write this down. This is one of the most helpful parts, especially because it helps you give a visual check as well as a numerical check to whatever answers or whatever you're doing when you shift stuff. So if we have an increase in supply, supply goes up, the price will go down and quantity goes up. If we have a decrease in supply, supply goes down, price will go up, quantity will go up, down. That's that inverse. They work in that opposite relationship. Demand, though, is a little bit different. They're going to work parallel to each other. Changes are going to happen at the same time. So if demand goes up, price goes up, quantity goes up. Demand goes down, price goes down, quantity goes down. Now, we also have movements. So any point on your actual given supply or demand curve can be a movement. So you can move up and down the curve without shifting it. A shift in one curve will never cause a shift in another right away. Rather, a shift in one curve causes a movement. You're moving along. You're moving to a new point. This brings us into a couple more examples. See, I told you this chapter has a lot of layers to it, and we'll work through those when we do the Excel example together too. So one of the big things too we also have is price ceilings and price floors. So you gotta think about a ceiling and you gotta think about a floor. Price floors and ceilings are both called price controls. So they're laws that the government will enact to kind of regulate prices and make sure things are running and operating how they should be. A price floor is the minimum price set. So that's a minimum thing. A price floor is the minimum. So an example of a price floor that's not really in a goods market, but in a labor market is our minimum wage. That's a price floor. That's the minimum that the government is allowed to pay people. And so all payments have to go above it, right? Federal minimum wage is 7.25. Massachusetts is 15 something. So that's the minimum you are allowed to get for hourly pay. Um, Price floors are good for some, they have pros and cons. So price floors are usually higher income for producers, higher income for laborers, but it's going to be higher prices, right? So if the cost of a laborer increases, then the price associated with whatever their good or services is probably going to increase too. It can sometimes encourage oversupply and what's called inefficiency in a marketplace. And usually it can also have some form of higher unemployment. That's something we'll talk about way later when we talk about marketplaces. Because if that price floor is set above equilibrium, then it's going to cause unemployment. but we're focused on goods right now, goods market. Our price ceiling, though, is the opposite, right? That's the maximum price. Usually, price ceilings happen with like rent control. So the maximum amount somebody's allowed to charge you for rent is a price ceiling. Usually, they're a little bit more pros. People, consumers are usually pretty okay with the price ceiling. There's also price ceilings with a lot of utilities. Price ceilings are all about affordability. They're usually made to address a wider section of society and help a lot of people out. But it can lower the supply of things, because it makes it a little bit more available to people. So that creates what's called a shortage. So a price ceiling might increase demand for a good because it makes it more available to people, which is going to create a shortage because there's not enough supply. It also might encourage a little bit of black market operation. So it might end up working in an opposite effect. So for an example, right? If we have our apartments market, right? Rent market. The rental price of apartments, or equilibrium in this case, without any controls on it, is 800 for 30, 300 units available, right? The average price is about $800. There are 300 units available. If we put in a price ceiling way above this equilibrium, it has no effect on our outcome, right? Our happy place is at $800. We're all good. That's the perfect amount of quantity. That's the perfect price. And a ceiling way above that doesn't do anything. A ceiling below that is actually going to be binding to us. That's going to affect our marketplace because it's below our equilibrium. And that's going to cause what's a shortage. So that's going to be that gap, right? So if our demand for a good exceeds our supply, that space between is a shortage because there's more demand. So people want more than what's available in our marketplace. In the long run, supply and demand are a little bit more what's called price elastic, and we'll talk about price elasticity in a later chapter. Therefore, we're end up going to have a bigger shortage than we originally would. Now, if we want to talk about that was right, that's our price ceiling. Remember, that's the maximum price we can set. Let's talk about a price floor. Like I said, labor market, usually minimum wage is one. This is talking about our W is our wage and L is like the amount of labor in a marketplace. So in this case, 500 what's called unskilled laborers. Unskilled labor is not devaluing labor, it's just talking about a certain type of labor. Unskilled labor is one that doesn't require a lot of training and has a special definition that we're going to get into when we talk about labor markets. So, a price floor, remember the minimum, um, is if it's below, it is not binding, has no effect on our marketplace, right? Our price floor is below what equilibrium is. That means equilibrium's doing its job. It's perfect. It's above. There's no need for that price floor. If our price floor, the minimum, is above our equilibrium, though, that's our binding constraint. That's going to give us what's called a surplus. So a surplus is when supply is exceeding demand. There's more available in our marketplace than we have demand for. In our case, minimum wage laws usually don't end up affecting what's called skilled workers, especially highly skilled workers, which are people who have a lot of training. They often end up affecting our like lower skilled marketplaces, like teen workers or entry-level positions. So this is a big thing to emphasize. This is something we'll go over too, because this is going to be on the problem sets. But we have surplus or our excess, right? Surplus means that our supply exceeds demand. And then our shortage is the opposite. That means demand exceeds supply. All right. The last part of this chapter, we're getting towards the end, is demand, supply, and what's called efficiency. We talked a little bit about efficiency last week, but we're going to get a little bit more into it. So we have different kinds of surplus. And this leads into efficiency. So we have consumer surplus. The amount of that individuals would be willing to pay minus the amount they actually paid for whatever. So that's a consumer surplus. The area above the market price and below our demand curve. And then we have producer surplus. That's the price the producer actually received minus the price the producer would have been willing to accept. The area between the market price and the segment of the supply curve below equilibrium. It's a little bit easier when we look at it visually. And this leads into these surpluses lead to what's called deadweight loss, which is the loss in social surplus when a market produces an inefficient quantity. So, our social surplus, our total surplus, is that consumer surplus and our producer surplus, right? So this is if we're producing outside of our equilibrium. If we're not at that perfect place, we're going to have some kind of excess um, or surplus. So in this case, right, our consumer surplus is all that stuff above our equilibrium. And our producer surplus is all that stuff below our equilibrium. So this is another example of it, right? So this example is more of in that linear sense that we've looked at before, straight lines. And the second example that's from the textbook is a little less linear. We got a little bit more of a curve. So all in all, last slide. Chapter's almost over. The law of demand describes how price affects consumers, and the law of supply is about producers. Demand, consumers, supply, producers, or firms. You want to refer to it as that. All right. Thank you for sticking with me. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Let me know. That's all for chapter 3. And I know this says micro. It's the same chapter in macro.